from Boston here. It's great to be with you. I understand that The War of the Worlds is your book for this month, and David
Yes.
couldn't get H.G. Wells, couldn't get H.G., so yeah, for me. And I will try to live up to it. So to answer your question, I had been interested, or I had been aware of the broadcast since I was a kid, because when I was very young, my parents always had difficulty getting me to go to sleep at night. And in the early 90s, a lot of these old radio shows were coming out on audio cassettes. So my folks would get me these audio cassettes to listen to at night as a way of quieting me down, and it worked. And I recall first encountering The War of the Worlds in a collection of old-time radio shows that had been selected by Walter Cronkite, which is another mid-20th century newsman on CBS. And I listened to it when I was a kid. I recall not liking it very much because I don't think I understood what Orson Welles was trying to do, but it was something that was in my head from a very early age. Later on, I did a project on it in high school and read about the Panic story and sort of knew, the story, the standard story that everybody was familiar with and still is to a large extent. And that was, again, in the back of my mind, but it wasn't until I got to college that I had any desire to write about this. And then one day I was taking a class, a film class, and a librarian came in who was in charge of the special collections and archives at the University of Michigan, where I was getting my undergrad degree. And the university had, at that time, relatively recently acquired a couple of large collections of Orson Welles's personal papers. Michigan has since become the largest repository of Orson Welles's archives in the world. Enormous collections of material that at that time were new. They had just been open for research. There wasn't a great deal of awareness of what was in them, but the librarian who gave a presentation to this class, basically encouraging us to write a paper about this stuff that was easily accessible to us, happened to mention that they included all of the letters that people sent to Orson Welles after the World's broadcast. And that's sort of when the light bulb went off in my head, because I, as I said, I knew the story from when I was a kid. I recall very specifically thinking, I'm a junior in college, but thinking, oh, there might be a book in there, assuming that all of the letters would be these sort of stories of panic that I'm sure many of you are familiar with if you watched any of the materials of the videos or the things that David sent around. Just sort of, I was initially very excited about what stories might be in there. And as luck would have it, I happened to, right around that time, have to come up with a topic for my senior thesis project. And I said, what about War of the Worlds? And they said, great. And so I went to the library, I checked out the boxes of the Orson Welles materials where the letters are. They're boxes 23 and 24. I still remember that very vividly. And, I pulled out, they're organized by state, and I pulled out Michigan because that's where I'm from. Again, sort of very excited to see what stories were in there. And I started flipping through the letters and discovering that almost none of them were from people who were panicked, or rather, they were from people who were frightened, but not by the broadcast. They were frightened by what the broadcast and the stories of the panic represented. And a lot of what they were saying in the letters seemed eerily relevant to our own internet and information age. This was back in 2011, 2012. Since then, the issues have only gotten more heightened and more extreme. But I was encountering something that gave me chills in terms of how familiar it was to my own experience. And I realized this, not only did I not understand what had happened and what this event represented, really nobody did, because the materials, the documentary record that would allow us to understand it had only just been made available. So I realized that in seeking a thesis project, I came up with something a lot more exciting. And after that, I was off and running.
Very good. So I have to tell you about a very serendipitous thing that happened yesterday. I went to give a talk to the Waterville Rotary Club, and the woman who invited me told me that her son really likes history. And she told me, not knowing what was going on at the library, that her son, who's 21, had trouble going to sleep at night. So she used to read books to him and give him old time radio shows. And his favorite one of all time, not knowing that we're doing this tonight, was War of the Worlds.
Wow.
To the
No
point
kidding.
that he named his pet dog Orson.
Oh, my word.
Well, that's, you can chase that because you never know how far it's going to take you, but that is amazing. I will say I
Yeah.
may not have enjoyed War of the Worlds as much when I was that age. I didn't. The Shadow was my favorite show, and so Orson
Oh
Welles
yeah, the
was
shadow.
my
yeah.
favorite in a different way. So
Yeah.
and then
The Shadow knows.
Yeah. Only the shadow knows.
Shadow knows exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So that is amazing. And they really do work. I mean, when you're a kid, you have that really, radio is the theater of the mind. You have that elastic imagination. Like there's nothing better than the pictures you can come up with in your mind. So even in the 21st century, if you're introduced to it at the right age, there is nothing better, even now.
So I have a list of other questions that I told Brad I might ask, but I want to open it up to the audience. If you have questions for him about the radio broadcast, or if any of you have delved into his book. And one of the things I like about his book, it's not just about the radio broadcast. For example, he has one whole chapter on H.G. Wells in the War of the Worlds. So this is your opportunity to ask him any questions that you might have about this story, which has been told and retold in many different ways since it first came out in 1897. Patty Baldwin.
In your book, what is the first example of fake news that you come up with to parallel this? What's your
You mean chronologically, the first example of fake news?
yeah, since after his speech that he made.
Oh, since after
After Orson Welles' broadcast.
Well, one of the things Brad does is he actually says that there are some antecedents.
Oh,
Right,
okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were asking. There were, going back into the newspaper era, there were hoaxes. The Great Moon hoax is one that I talk about in the book from the mid-19th century. But even once you get into the mass media age, I mean, Orson Welles was not the first person to do something like this. There was what I often think about as the first sort of fake news broadcast in history, as far as I'm aware, or as far as anybody has documented it. Occurred in 1926 over the BBC in Great Britain, when a Catholic priest by the name of Ronald Knox did what was supposed to be a parody of a BBC newscast that was describing a revolt of the unemployed in London, where they're hanging cabinet ministers from tramway posts and marching on Parliament. Which again, when I wrote the book, it seemed funnier than it does now, perhaps. But that was another instance where it was done. It was meant to be read in a very dry sort of, again, making fun of the BBC and how they would report. Somebody later, this came up in the Murrow research, but there was a joke that if the world was going to end, the BBC would say, the world ended today at 3 p.m. and there was a debate in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing. But because of the content of the broadcast, because nobody had done anything like this before, and particularly because of the times, the historical context is always very important with something like this. In 1926 is not that far on from the Russian Revolution. It's, there had been a rural strike in the UK. There had been a lot of labor unrest and concern about that segment of society, workers' rebellion. And so much like with War of the Worlds, there seemed to have been phone calls and people wanting to know what was going on, and various degrees of agitation were reported. And it can be a challenge to nail down exactly how much agitation there was, but it did convince some people that this was a real event. And supposedly that was an influence on War of the Worlds. But after Welles, there's an interesting phenomenon in that the War of the Worlds was so notorious and so frightening to broadcasters because of the threat that it would lead to further government regulation, that the major broadcast networks in particular really clamped down on themselves and their talent to prevent anybody from doing anything like this ever again. So there was a 25 or 30-year period where anything that looked like a news broadcast or sounded like a news broadcast in a fictional context was anathema. Once you get to the 30th anniversary of the War of the Worlds, there's a version that's done in Buffalo, New York. And there are later broadcasts that Special Bulletin is one that was done on television that was supposed to be about a nuclear terrorist detonating a nuclear bomb, I think in Charleston, South Carolina, that was done realistically and, announced as a dramatic production, but some people misinterpreted it. Without Warning was another one that was done in the 90s. There's a famous one that was done in the UK called Ghost Watch about a haunted house. But when I was writing the book, starting as my thesis in 2011, 2012, and then the book came out in 2015, I was looking at some of the early viral, fake news phenomena. I always have to qualify, the use of the term fake news in the book because it came out in 2015. Before that was that took on different political connotations.
Mhm.
I was ahead of the curve in that sense. So I was tuned into, there were various things that had happened on Twitter. One that's mentioned in the book is, where rumors or misinformation about, I think there was one down in, was it Mexico, where there was drug violence and people were spreading reports of attacks on local schools that were not true, and it got spread on social media. False reports of an attack on the White House, I think it was, led to a brief drop in the stock market. So these sort of quote unquote fake news events were coming up. But since the book has come out, we've seen it sort of enter the political sphere and be really weaponized in that context. So I was vaguely aware of the direction things were heading. I can't say I saw in any degree where they were going. I hope that answers your question. That was sort of over 100 years. I rambled over.
100 years of fake news. 5 minutes.
Right.
Bob Nicholson.
You're muted.
Bob.
You're muted.
Unmute, Bob.
Unmute. We need a sign.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay, thanks for coming tonight, Brad. What does it tell you about human gullibility that the radio show compressed the entire timeline into less than 1 hour, from blast off to Mars to mass extermination to final kill by bacteria?
Worse than that, less than 40 minutes, because the station break comes about 38 or so minutes into the show. So yeah, the entire invasion is under. The thing that you see when you do look at, it was a subset of people who were frightened, and you always sort of have to keep the demographics of it in mind. But when you look at the sort of the letters and the testimony from people who tuned in, who were oftentimes very specific about the circumstances, because that was their defense. That was their way of saying, anybody who tuned in under the right conditions would have been frightened. It's not because I'm any less intelligent than the average person. Most people who were frightened, actually, if they heard the show at all, they heard very little of it, or they came in at a particular time. It wasn't the show itself that in most cases was convincing to the subset of people who were frightened. When I was going through the letters, my first inkling of this was I noticed a lot of the most extreme examples of fright came from college campuses and dormitories and things like that. And I sort of wondered why that was. And I realized that it was because it was this, a lot of young and perhaps immature people living close together in a contained space. And all it takes is one person to misinterpret the broadcast and then go tell 5 people who tell 5 people who tell 5 people. And it goes viral very quickly. And once I was aware of that phenomenon, I started seeing it everywhere. It was people, who said, who lived in New Jersey and said, my aunt in California called me and said, you got to turn on CBS, or even less than that, just called me and said, you got to get out of town because something's happening. I just heard it on the radio. And so again, the people who were most frightened, who were most convinced that this was real, heard snatches of it. If they heard it at all, were more convinced in many cases by the messenger than by the message itself, because they were being told by someone they trusted, a friend, a relative, a family member. So yeah, the invasion only takes 40 minutes, but if you tune in at minute 20 and you hear 5 minutes, you're not as aware of that fact. And it's also important to note as well that most of the people who were frightened, and we know this from the survey that was done later by Princeton, didn't know that the show was about aliens. They thought it was the Germans or some sort of natural
Oh,
disaster.
wow.
Because it's 1938. We're
It's
less
interesting.
a month after the Munich crisis.
Right.
So even people who, if you listen to the sort of the midsection of the broadcast after the spaceship is opened up and the war machines have come out, the war machine that I'm wearing on my shirt here.
Yeah.
I dress costume change for the occasion. But they don't say Martians and aliens. They say invader and war machine. So who's to say that it's not the Nazis? And that's what a lot of people, that's where their minds instantly went.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if you're listening to it all the way through, it seems a little ridiculous. But if you're, listening to it under those circumstances, it takes on a very different character.
Thanks and good luck with your project.
Thank you. Thank you for it's a great question.
I listened to it at lunch today, and it's striking. It takes a long while to get into the scary part. The first 15 minutes or so, I think like 10 minutes of it are music.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of cutaways to special bulletins, and there's not really all that much, nothing alarming in the first bulletins.
Right.
And so I can see very easily, and I think I was watching some of the PBS documentary that you were involved with last night. I think they were also talking about the phenomenon of most people that night who were listening to the radio would have been listening to Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, but at commercial breaks, they might have switched over.
Mhm.
And so it's a matter of when you're surfing into the broadcast. And if the part with the death ray, the heat ray
Yeah.
is incinerating Charles Palmer or whatever the name of the reporter is. Yeah, that can be scary.
Played by the great Frank Reddick, who was radio's first shadow. He was the first shadow before.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Anyone else have any questions before we return to my set of questions? Feel free. This is your chance.
Was there anything in your research that you kind of stepped back and went, wow, that you really didn't kind of see coming or didn't expect to find out? Something really surprising that you didn't know?
Well, the whole thing.
Yeah, besides the whole thing, but
Yeah, it's part of it is I was doing this 10 years ago now, so it can be difficult to go back to my frame of mind back then. I mean, what really surprised me, honestly, and I got into this earlier, was how overwhelmingly positive the response to the broadcast was. Because again, we expect that it frightened everybody and that people were sort of outraged. Even people who were frightened in many cases came around to appreciate it very soon. One of the letters that I'm sure is in the book, I know it is. It was my favorite, where this woman, it was a handwritten sort of one page, Orson Welles, you horrible, terrible person, you scared me half to death, da, 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 da. And then crammed into the bottom of the page is a postscript. Upon thinking about it, I must say it was marvelous and accept my congratulations. I mean, a lot of minds very quickly. And then once the story hit the papers, and it became a controversy, and Wells, there was talk about Wells being taken off the air, sort of increased government censorship. That's what then motivated a lot of the writing about of letters to Orson Welles and to the FCC, people who were concerned that he was going to take it off the air and concerned that this was going to be a pretext for increased government control and censorship. Because again, the historical context, Americans are very aware of what the Nazis were doing with the mass media, Germany, and very concerned. I mean, people wrote this explicitly in the letters about their concern about an American Hitler, or somebody who could get control of the airwaves and sort of hypnotize everybody. We know it's more complicated than that, but that was a very real fear that people had. And so that it resonated when I was reading the letters 10 years ago. It certainly resonates more as the time goes on. people saying things like it shakes one's faith in democracy to think that the people who were frightened by this broadcast have to vote intelligently in a week. The things that people articulated, their fears about specifically what the new instrument of radio would do to American democracy, seemed to me then and seemed to me now very applicable to the internet, and even more.
Yeah.
So. That's
Yeah.
what surprised me, and that's what kept me engaged, because this thing this story that seemed like an old myth and something that was talked about in terms of nostalgia, was just sort of a funny joke thing, actually ended up being a major turning point in the history of media and American democracy, and that's what really pulled me in.
And again, one of the things I like about this book, it's not just about the radio broadcast. So you have a whole chapter about the rivalry between newspapers and radio. And it sort of parallels some of the competition we have today and concerns about what's the place of newspapers in the realm of the internet age. So again, there's a lot of meat in this book. So can you talk more about the newspaper coverage of this event? Because in terms of looking at this concept of fake news, Orson Welles is very clear that this is fake. This is entertainment. And I was especially paying attention to how he concluded the broadcast, really trying to reinforce that, this is a joke. I'm just trying to entertain you. But I think you would say in the book, they've already were starting to get calls at the switchboard.
They were. Yes.
But so
and he knew by that point. I mean, that's nobody knew what the extent of it was. The initial fears were that it was much worse than it was turned out to be. And so, that's where Wells, who was, generally unflappable and very articulate, he trips over his words in that monologue. He at the end, he doesn't say the next best thing. He says the best next thing. Because, by that point, there have been cops in the studio and he's sort of like, oh my God. So it sounds very jolly. And that was the one thing that CBS executives didn't want him to say, because it implies that this was all done as a Halloween prank. It implies intent.
Okay.
If he had planned to frighten people, as sort of he claimed in later years that he did, he maybe wouldn't have said it that way, because then that potentially opened him up to lawsuits. So the network executives tried to prevent him from reading it. They failed. But you can tell, even though he sounds very jolly, he's actually quite nervous. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you?
So talk about the press coverage of the broadcast, because that's what drives our sense that this created a panic in the country, which it didn't.
Yeah, not on any mass scale. There were localized pockets of it, certainly, and that's what got reported in the newspapers. And they made the mistake of stitching those pockets together into sort of the tidal wave of terror, as one of the newspapers said. You have to remember that the first impulse for many people who were frightened or who even had any question about what they were hearing was to try to verify it, which is actually it's what you should do when you hear something that seems too incredible to believe. Nowadays, when we all have immediate access to the internet, that's a lot easier to do. Back then, the best way to do that for many people was to call sources of authority, the radio station. Many people called the police, or they called their local newspaper. And so much of what hysteria and fright there was actually ends up being directed at newspaper offices who have no idea what's going on. They're expecting a quiet, it's a Sunday evening, they're expecting a quiet news day. And suddenly many newspapers, especially on the East Coast, around New York and New Jersey, are getting all these calls about people with, again, different understandings about what's happening, because they're tuning in at different times. They're hearing it from other people. So some people are saying a meteor has fallen in New Jersey. Some people are saying the Martians have invaded. Some people are saying the Germans are attacking, that, nobody knows. And so if you're in a newspaper office on that night, you're already getting an exaggerated sense of what's happening. And then on top of that, the wire services, the Associated Press in particular, start collecting the best examples of, people behaving in extreme ways. Someone's running into a church service screaming about the end of the world, or there was one about a guy going to Reno to save the wife he was divorcing or something like that. So those go out, around to all the newspapers. And when you look at the news coverage that was printed in, outside of New York and New Jersey, most of the stories are those bulletins, the same bulletins describing these isolated instances, and then stitched together with, untold, these assumptions that untold thousands of listeners thrown into terror and ran out of their homes. And so it was the assumption that these isolated extreme examples were representative of a larger phenomenon that created this false narrative. And so it's a very it's a good example of how, even when you're, a journalistic organization is trying to get the story right, in the early hours of Monday morning before the paper goes to press, their own false assumptions, their own, just mistaken beliefs can create a false narrative that is then very hard to get out of the public consciousness. And so, for example, there's a scholar by Michael at the University of Maine, also quite a bit about War of the Worlds, and he published an article not too long ago, I think it was for the 80th anniversary, but noting how a lot of the newspapers that the stories that ended up in the newspapers were using, when they describe listeners, they're using stereotypes of women, hysterical women. That's something that comes over and over again. There were racist assumptions into it as well. And so you see that the biases, the assumptions, they were letting their imaginations run away with them a bit and going beyond the evidence that was available to them time. But once it's, Orson Welles broadcast causes a mass panic, then that's the headline, and that becomes the narrative, and it takes on a life of its own.
And I think another point you make in the book, at some point, Orson Welles decides this works to the advantage of his career.
It takes him a while.
Yeah.
It takes him about 25 years before he can laugh about this. There's the book I talk about, the famous meeting in Texas 2 years after War of the Worlds, when Orson Welles and H.G. Wells both happened to be in San Antonio at the same time, and a radio station brings them together for a conversation. And it's fascinating to listen to, because they start by talking about, and H.G. Wells, who initially was very upset about what seemed at first like bad publicity, and then the novel started selling like crazy, and he changed his mind. So by 1940, he had a much improved opinion of Orson Welles, my little namesake, as he called him. So they start by talking about the panic, and HG is sort of laughing about it, and Orson Welles downplays it. He wants to talk about his new film, Citizen Kane, and so that is an example of how Orson Welles he wanted to move on in his career. It's not until I think 55 when he has that show on the BBC, Orson Welles' Sketchbook, where he does Orson does a monologue where he starts to mythologize, exaggerate the stories of panic. And so that becomes a part of his repertoire that is on talk shows and other sort of things. And so as he gets older and he's on Tonight Show and everything, he leans into it. His film F for Fake has an extended sequence about the War of the Worlds that has no relationship to what actually happened at all. But by that point, I talk about this in the book, but later on in his career, when he's young and he's going to Hollywood and he's focused on his filmmaking projects, he wants to leave War of the Worlds behind. But later on, as he runs into difficulty in his career. He never has the advantages, the same advantages that he did after Citizen Kane. His persona of the man from Mars becomes one of the assets that he can sort of trade in on. And so he ends up near the end of his life building the legend. Way to certainly think of him, just seem to want to leave it behind.
Anyone else have other questions? I can't remember if you addressed this in the book. Why did Orson Welles pick War of the Worlds?
He didn't really pick it. It started out that he had an idea. Again, having observed what had happened with the Munich crisis a month before this broadcast happened, and being a very astute observer of current events, that's what made a lot of his work, particularly in the 30s, so vital and refreshing to. He had this notion that he wanted to do a radio show that sounded like a news broadcast, that was as engaging to his audience as the news reports of people like Edward R. Murrow reporting on the Munich diplomatic crisis, September 1930. So he wanted to do something that was as engaging, as exciting, as terrifying as the real news of the late 1930s. But the whole point of his radio show, The Mercury Theater on the Air, was to adapt classic works of literature, and he didn't have a book he could apply this to. So he discussed it with his two sort of key collaborators on these broadcasts, John Houseman, his producing partner, who many years later, if you've seen the film The Paper Chase, he is the professor in that.
Many of us probably remember from, was it E.F. Hutton he was the pitch man for?
I don't know.
Well, that was
The Dean Witter or more something.
That wasn't him. That was Hausman.
Yeah, John Houseman.
Oh, wait. Oh, I was thinking of the guy from, oh yeah, that was the paper. I'm sorry. I was thinking of the guy who played the doctor on St. Elsewhere that just died. That was in all the Hitchcock movies, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Confused my actors.
So before that, when John Houseman was much younger, he was Orson Welles' producing partner in the Mercury Theater on the Air, and also there was an actor in the Mercury Company whose name was Paul Stewart, who later on plays the butler in Citizen Kane. If you've seen that film, you've seen Paul Stewart. But he was sort of the associate director on the Mercury broadcasts. And Orson Welles discusses it with the two of them. And it's in that conversation that War of the Worlds comes up. It seems that John Houseman is the one who suggests it. John Houseman also suggests that Orson Welles had never read the War of the Worlds, but claimed that he had and said, that'll be great. And he was, Orson Welles at that time was deep in rehearsals for a stage production, for the stage version of the Mercury Theater that was not going very well. So that in the run up to the broadcast, his focus is very much on that. And so they have a writer who they had recently hired, a struggling playwright by the name of Howard Koch, who also, all these members of the Mercury Company who were about to be catapulted into fame because of their association with Orson Welles. Howard Koch is one of them. He would go on to co-write the screenplay for Casablanca, and have a lot of other success in Hollywood before he was blacklisted. But he's the one who actually reads the book and is assigned to translate it into a script. And after reading in about 6 days, less than that, because the rehearsals began on Thursday. And he's assigned the book on Monday. So he reads it and calls John Houseman and says, this isn't going to work. The book, you've read it. So it's like Koch describes it as a history book about an event that never happened. It's a chronicle. It's more impersonal. The Mercury shows were all about what Orson Welles called the first person singular, about having a strong narrative voice, about having someone, sit you down and say, this happened to me. War of the Worlds, even though it's told in the first person, it's not really like that as much. And Koch he thought the Martian invasion plot was silly. He thought nobody would believe it, or even as much as to the extent of buying into it dramatically. He just did not have faith in it. And so John Houseman tries to reach Orson Welles, probably fails because Welles was so busy with his rehearsals, and calls Howard Koch back and says, no, it's got to be War of the Worlds. This is Orson's favorite project. And the rest is history.
So you, as I mentioned, you have a chapter where you talk about the book, The War of the Worlds. I assume you've read it. What do you think?
Long time ago. It's brilliant. I mean, it's again, it's easy to forget now how revolutionary it was, because the Martian invasion, the alien invasion, has become such a staple of our popular culture that it's easy to forget that this is really the first time. I mean, you can make a case for any number of more obscure things in the past, but this is really the first time that a war between humanity and an alien race appears in world literature. And so it establishes an entire genre. And you have to remember too that H.G. Wells, he writes 4 or 5 novels in the 1890s: Time Machine, Invisible Man, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The War of the Worlds, and I'm leaving out, I think, at least one.
Those are the 4, and then in 1901, First Men in the Moon.
Yeah, that's thank you. And each one of those establishes a subgenre of science fiction. It's an astonishing creative outburst, and it's a book that has a lot more in common with the broadcast than I think people give it credit for, because all the building blocks are there. I mean, Howard Koch changed the place names and modernized it, but the campaign of the Martians to conquer the world is exactly what H.G. Wells laid out. And I think you can't read it. I mean, that's why it's lived on, and it's had so many great. I'm particularly a fan of the Steven Spielberg version as another modernization of it, which has a great deal of which shows a great more fealty to the book than perhaps again appears on the surface. But that sense of the depiction of the most powerful country in the world at that time falling apart is still chilling and is still applicable as it was transplanted to the United States in 1938 and in 2005 by Steven Spielberg, and in 1953 by George Pal. And then of course the ending. It's one of the great twist endings of all time. That again has been enormously influential. So like I said, I haven't read it in quite a number of years now. I kind of want to. I can't be anything more specific.
I have one last question, but Patty.
You're muted.
Yeah, she's
trying to unmute herself there.
She's using a new device tonight.
Oh.
She's using a tablet.
And having some problems with that, huh? Oh, you are still muted, Patty.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I have a new tablet. So I read your book and I liked it very much.
Thank you.
I thought it was like super relevant, and I think anyone who is like a news person, politics, all of that, I think should read it, because I just found it so relevant to what's happening now with so many outrageous stories you hear about in the news that people believe, about, I don't know, children eating and all that. I don't even want to talk about it.
Pizza parlors in Washington with pedophiles.
Oh, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
it's horrifying to think that people believe stuff that, without any evidence, without anything to back it up. And I'm just curious if your book that you know of is being used in journalism schools or anywhere. I mean, are people teaching about this, and who are the people in our public who's the one who finally stands up and say, hey, people, this is wrong. Like, this isn't true, you know? How do we get people to know that it's just not true? I don't know. I just thought your book was really, really relevant for what's happening right now in American politics.
Thank you. That's a terrific question and a difficult question, obviously. It's the question of our time in many ways. I am aware of the book being taught in journalism classes and various undergraduate and even high school places. There was, I had the dubious good fortune of, for a long time, of being the first thing on Amazon that came up when you search fake news. And so it got a lot of attention in that regard. You know, and I'm actually involved with a project at my alma mater at the University of Michigan, where they're in the process of digitizing. They have digitized all of the War of the Worlds letters. They're working to make them available, not just for research, but primarily to high schools and colleges, along with lesson plans built around the book and the letters as a teaching tool, specifically to teach media literacy. You know, activities, and I've test driven it myself, even with kids as young as like third grade. You know, where you have them read some of the letters and compare it to a newspaper article and think about you know, what's left out of the news story, how has it been misinterpreted, you know, how would it have been better, the news article, if they had access to some of this firsthand testimony, those sorts of things. So, you know, you can scale it up or scale it down in complexity depending on the grade level that you're dealing with, but the underlying purpose is the same, and it's to teach exactly what you're talking about, media literacy, because, you know, that is a skill that can be taught, and it must be taught. I mean, it should be as integral a part of our curriculum as math or science or anything else. And it's, you know, there are initiatives and projects to make it so, but it really is, I think, the best way to counteract or inoculate ourselves against the misinformation that proliferates in various corners of the internet. You know, because I mean, you know, your reaction to you know, how can people believe some of this stuff is really exactly the same as people, you know, in 1938 reading the newspaper article and saying, how can anybody believe in something so ridiculous as a Martian invasion? And the answer is, I mean, A, it was in 1938, the newspaper articles were exaggerated, but B, you know, people are inclined to believe in something that confirms their preconceived fears, attitudes, biases, prejudices. And that was that, you know, that finding, that insight came out of the early research that was done by the Princeton Radio Research Project, trying to understand why people were frightened by War of the Worlds. I mentioned most people who were frightened did not understand the show was about aliens. In many cases, it was, you know, their own, if they were particularly concerned about the threat posed by the Nazis, or people who were particularly religious, had a particularly strong belief in the biblical Armageddon, who interpreted the broadcast in that way. So, you know, it depended on, as Hadley Cantrell called it, the frame of reference that you were applying to the broadcast. If you were prepared in whatever way to accept that, you know, this input was a real thing, then you shaped it in your own head into something that was more believable to you. And, you know, not only is that fundamental to human nature and still the case, and the reason why people, you know, who have whatever in their background end up being susceptible to this sort of misinformation. But now we have built technology that is getting more sophisticated all the time in targeting people, in directing media messages to them that, you know, in order to keep them engaged, the algorithms sort of always push you towards something that's more extreme, and people can get pulled down. I mean, it's a cliche to get people that people get pulled down rabbit holes and end up in sort of these information silos, but they do. And that's how you get people who, if you're not in the middle of it, they seem totally disconnected from reality. But they have sort of self-selected into a reality that meets their needs. And so the only way to prevent that from happening is to teach people, kids, very young, to think more critically about where this information is coming from. What's the objective behind it? How do I verify? How do I analyze? How do I compare it to other sources to try and get closer to the truth of what's actually happening? Again, that's a skill that can be taught, and I think it can save lives. And I would like to see more of that being done in our schools.
So it's getting close to 8, and I promised Brad that we would wrap up by 8, and I want to give him the opportunity to tie together his Wells project with his Murrow project. So Brad, can you tell people about the relationship of Edward R. Murrow to the War of the Worlds, this docudrama that he was a part of in 1957, which I sent out the link for it, and I would really commend it to people. It's very interesting, not only for the very famous young actors who are in it, but just the whole take almost 20 years later on the War of the Worlds. So Brad, you want to try to tie those two things together?
Sure. I mean, the connection goes back even farther than that, of course, because it's CBS News and then CBS Mercury Theater. And the reputation that CBS had, thanks to people like Murrow as the news network, is one contributing factor to why some people, were more likely to believe that the show was true, because they had come to trust CBS News. And Murrow and the news team that he was building were very aware of this as it happened. I came across a letter when I was going through the papers of William Shirer, who was sort of the first of Murrow's boys. He was the first correspondent that Murrow hired in Europe before World War II. Murrow, I don't know if he was in the United States when the broadcast happened, but he came home very soon, around that time, for a visit from Europe. And he writes Shirer and says something to the effect that I've gotten the whole story of War of the Worlds here. It's not something to be put in a letter, but I'll tell it to you the next time I see you, which of course I'm thinking, yes, it is exactly something you can put in a letter. I can read about it 85 years later. So that was very disappointing, but yes, 20 years after the fact, I rewatched the show recently myself after sending it to you, and it is fascinating in the context of my current project of trying to understand Murrow and his legacy and what he represented and what he brought to broadcast journalism, not just in terms of inventing it, which he arguably did more than anybody else, but in creating a persona, bringing that own sort of his own personal charisma and gravitas to the news, gave it credibility and gave it a power that it may not have otherwise have had in its early days. And he's applying that same, magic to that show, because he's the narrator. He's presenting this to you sort of as a news report. He didn't, I doubt he wrote his own lines. He may have tinkered with them a little bit, but it's an example of how that can sort of lead you into dangerous territory, because the opening of the show is those people driving in the car. I think it was it Warren Beatty and Warren Oates, I think, were the two, maybe the two actors. But listening to the broadcast, and they're so agitated they get into a car crash, and then Murrow's voice, I think it's the first time you hear Murrow in the show, and he says, "This is the result of panic. This is, we're going to tell you the factual story of War of the Worlds." Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, I mean, there's dispute about, one woman claims she broke her arm. There were one or two rumors of heart attacks. But the one thing that absolutely did not happen was car wrecks. That was something that everybody expected would happen as a result of the broadcast. There are no, certainly, reports I'm aware of any serious, example of getting into an auto accident of the broadcast. and the stories of people injuring themselves or fleeing. That's one reason we know this wasn't as big an event as people say, because those injuries, the Princeton Radio Research Project even went around to hospitals and found that there were nothing unusual compared to as far as admissions. So that whole show, which has some, when they're cutting back and forth between the broadcasts in the studio and the reaction that it has, and some of the vignettes are kind of based on real things. They're dramatized, but they go to some extreme places that very quickly depart from the facts, and then you keep coming back to Murrow describing this as if it were a documentary, which it's not. And so it ended up, that when I think about my current project, and it's, I'm still, as David said, I'm still traveling around, I'm still gathering material, I'm trying not to form conclusions until I know what I'm dealing with. But those questions of, the line between fact and drama, between truth and exaggeration, between real news and fake news. I feel like I did fake news with my first book. Now I'm coming back to journalism and trying to explore real news. But those are the questions that I'm interested in. And so perhaps when the Murrow Project is eventually a book, I'll have more to say about the night America trembled. But for now, I encourage everybody to check it out, because at the very least, it is quite entertaining, and it is sort of Murrow at the top of his game in the late 50s.
Well, I want to thank you very much,
Thank
Brad,
you.
for being with us tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm just sorry I couldn't be back in that lovely conference where I was working 2 weeks ago.
You have a lot more research to do, but if you ever need to come back here to the Margaret Chase Smith Library, we'll be happy to host you. And good luck with your Murrow project.
Yeah.
And I look forward to reading the biography
By all means.
of Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah.
I look forward to sharing it with you all. Thank you so
All
much.
right.
Thank you,
you.
Brad.
So for the rest of the group, thank you for